So prior to watching this, I knew very little about Wicked. I knew it was a thing, I've heard a couple of the songs, but apart from the fact that it's a loose prequel to The Wizard of Oz, that's all I knew. And having watched the film, I liked it, but I think there's going to be a very different experience going into this if you're just, like me, watching it as a movie, experiencing this story for the first time, compared to someone going in who's seen the show and is watching this as an adaptation. Because if you weren't already aware, this is half a movie. It's taking the first half of the stage production and just doing that, which makes it an inherently incomplete experience. And there's some weird side effects with that, because whenever you're splitting a story in two rather than doing a new story like in a regular sequel, you have to make a pretty important decision about where you make that chop. And by all accounts, it was pretty easy to decide where that would happen with Wicked. The show is split into 2 acts with an intermission in the middle, so the movie just copies exactly that and stops right where the intermission would be. And the song that was written for it, Defying Gravity, was designed to be this big climactic showstopper right before there's a pause. And even though there's still more to explore, it ends on a pretty resolute note for these characters in this movie. But even though that split works well and is satisfying for our main characters, it doesn't completely work for me for the whole movie. Because there's all the other subplots. There's the Munchkin Bok, there's the Sister Nessa, the Prince, who I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to. They're perfectly fine characters, their actors do a great job, but they really don't have that much to do in this film. And if you already know the full story, that might be fine, because you know how these things that are set up here will eventually play out later. It can be really fun to have more information than the characters do, especially when you're watching something that's an adaptation. But for me, as a first-time viewer, I can only judge these characters based on what I'm seeing in this movie. And to me, it feels like all the interesting stuff is gonna happen in part 2. Because coming out of this movie, I did not really care about those side characters. Minor spoiler warning here, but the last time we see these side characters in the movie is approximately about an hour and 40 minutes in. And then apart from a couple of brief no dialogue shots at the very end, we don't see them for the final hour of this film. They kind of just disappear from the story and then they never come back up again. And I wonder if this is a weird side effect of how unique an adaptation Wicked is, because this is far from the first movie to be split into 2 parts. It happened with Harry Potter, Twilight, and recently with Dune. But the vast majority of movies that have been split into 2 parts are adaptations of books. And those books are usually long enough where you could fill a whole TV series if you were to film every word that was in there. Even across 2 films, things have to be trimmed down. But with Wicked, the show, it's nearly 3 hours long, and that's nearly the full runtime of this movie. And there's a whole nother movie coming. So this film, unlike other adaptations, is actually an expansion of this story. And that has consequences, because this story was written as a musical to be told in one evening. And even though the act break of the play gives this movie a very natural point to stop at, it was still designed to stop for the stage, with the idea that everyone would be back in their seats in 15 minutes. So I would imagine with the stage production, you don't really need to do any sort of mini conclusion with the side characters, because they've only been out of the story for a short period of time, and they're going to be back into it right after the intermission. But the ending of this film isn't an intermission. It's an ending. I've got to wait a year to find out if these characters become relevant again, but there's no forward momentum to their story. They're just sort of forgotten about in this film. And look, you could make the argument that once both movies are out, you could watch them back to back and simulate the experience you would have if you were watching the show. But doing that would likely take between 5.5 to 6 hours. Aside from the most die-hard of Wicked fans, most people aren't going to experience the story that way. So it leaves this one feeling really weird. Audiences watching the movie, at least when it comes to the side characters, are kind of left with a cliffhanger, but one that doesn't have any tension or excitement or give any sort of notion of what's going to happen next. And then there's also the fact that the marketing hasn't told people that this is part 1, that there's going to be parts of the story that are unresolved. Thankfully, I knew this was only going to be part 1 because I'd followed the news of it, but I feel like the average person is going to go into this expecting a full story. And the fact that the marketing has intentionally withheld that information sends a signal that they think audiences would be put off if they knew they weren't getting the full story. It's an interesting move, films dropping the part 1 from their titles, and it doesn't seem to have hurt the bottom line of this movie at all. But I'd love to know if it impacts your enjoyment of the film if you're suddenly met with a cliffhanger when you were expecting to get a full story. Now with all that, I'm not saying that they should have kept this as one movie. From what I've heard from fans of the stage production, people seem to agree that splitting it was a good idea to let the story breathe. Apparently the second act on the stage is quite rushed. The argument is that splitting it into 2 movies allows things to be paced a lot better and just breathe a bit more. And that makes a lot of sense. I do think that the problems caused by doing this in 2 parts is probably just a necessary consequence of telling this story right. But I still find it really interesting how the split causes problems for the story no matter which way you slice it. Now again, I haven't seen the show and I genuinely do not know what's going to happen in Wicked Part 2, so maybe my concerns are going to be completely null and void once we see what happens there. But if you've made it this far and you haven't seen the show, I'd be really interested to know if people are having the same experience I did with it. And if you have seen the show, how successful was this as an adaptation? Let me know in the comments.